They never called to congratulate me on saving six figures. They just filed a motion to have a judge hand it to my sister. My mother demanded I sign. My father threatened to prove me unfit. My sister stared at my bank app like it was oxygen. I thought the hearing would be about my money, until my lawyer slid a single page across the table and told them to read the owner's name out loud. That was Friday morning. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back to the knock on my door 3 nights earlier. My name is Paisley Reed. I am 34 years old, and my Friday night was supposed to consist of nothing more complicated than balancing my monthly budget on my laptop. The spreadsheet glowing in the dim light of my living room was a quiet testament to years of aggressive saving, frugal living, and a relentless focus on stability. I had finally crossed a threshold most people my age only dreamed of. My savings account had just hit 6 figures. Then the doorbell rang. It was not a polite, neighborly chime. It was a frantic, continuous hammering that echoed through the quiet hallway of my apartment, vibrating right into my chest. I opened the door to find my mother, my father, and my younger sister, Brielle, standing on my welcome mat. There was no greeting. There was no polite inquiry about my week. Before the door was even fully open, my mother thrust a thick stack of stapled papers into my chest. Her face was tight, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. "Sign it," she demanded, her voice carrying the sharp, entitled edge I had spent a decade trying to escape. "The lawyer said as soon as the court orders it, the money in your account will be officially preserved for the family. We are taking control before you can hide it." I took a step back, the heavy legal packet awkward in my hands. I looked past my mother to Brielle. My sister was a frantic mess of smeared mascara, designer clothes, and trembling hands. Brielle had spent the last 2 years playing the visionary founder of a boutique wedding planning studio. That studio was now collapsing under the weight of breached contracts, furious brides, and missing vendor deposits. "I just need $140,000, Brielle sobbed, grabbing my forearm with desperate, digging fingers. "I need to settle this before Monday. Paisley, if I do not have the money by Monday morning, I am completely ruined. They are going to sue me. They are going to take everything. My car, my apartment, everything." My father stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. He did not look at me like a daughter. He looked at me like a locked vault. He was annoyed he had to crack. "If you do not hand over the money, we will cut ties with you forever," my father stated, his tone chillingly flat. "We are doing this by the book. We hired a firm. We are bringing this to a judge. No more of your selfish hoarding when your own blood is drowning." I looked down at the top page of the thick packet. The bold, capitalized letters at the top read, "Emergency Motion for Injunction and Asset Preservation." The breath hitched in my throat, but not from sorrow. The realization settled over me like a blanket of ice. They were not here to beg. They were not here to ask for a loan or appeal to my sibling loyalty. They had brought legal documents to my front door. They had come to confiscate what was mine. They genuinely believed that because we shared a bloodline, my bank account was their rightful emergency fund, subject to their immediate withdrawal. They had made a critical miscalculation. However, they saw me as the quiet, obedient sister who always backed down to avoid a family fight. They forgot what I actually did for a living. I work as a forensic compliance manager at Marine Ridge Compliance Systems. My entire professional existence revolves around reading the fine print, hunting down corporate loopholes, and uncovering systemic fraud. My daily 9-to-5 involves dissecting complex legal jargon to find exactly where people are lying, hiding assets, or trying to bend the rules to escape liability. I eat legal threats for breakfast, and I trace illicit money trails for fun. They thought a standardized, poorly drafted court motion would intimidate me into submission. Instead, it just activated my working brain, but I knew better than to show my hand. Confrontation would only make them defensive, erratic, and harder to manage. If I wanted to dismantle this attack, I needed them comfortable. I needed them arrogant. I needed them to believe they had already won. So, I played the role they expected. I played the good, anxious daughter who was terrified of authority. I let my shoulders slump forward, physically shrinking in the doorway. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly as I gripped the edges of their ridiculous emergency motion. I widened my eyes, projecting a mix of fear and naive submissiveness. "I do not want anyone to get in trouble," I whispered, injecting a slight quiver into my voice. "But if I help Brielle, is there a way to do it properly? I mean, with the bank and taxes and everything, a sudden transfer of $140,000 is going to trigger red flags. I just do not want the IRS or the bank fraud department to freeze the transfer if we do it the wrong way. We could all end up under investigation." The shift in their demeanor was instant and entirely predictable. The hostility evaporated, replaced by the greedy eagerness of scammers who just realized the mark was falling for the pitch. My mother's face softened into a sickly sweet mask of manipulative maternal pride. "You can handle it, right?" my mother said, stepping closer and patting my arm as if I were a clever pet who had just learned a new trick. "You are smart with all that finance stuff at your job. You know how to move it so nobody asks questions." "Exactly," my father agreed, his chest puffing out slightly, confident that his brute force tactic had worked flawlessly. "Figure out the cleanest way to get the funds to your sister's account by tomorrow afternoon. Just make sure the paperwork is clean so the court drops the motion. You handle the compliance." They were so blinded by their own panic and greed that they did not even realize what they had just asked me to do. They had just given a forensic compliance auditor explicit permission to dig into their financial chaos and structure a binding paper trail. They wanted me to build a bridge for their money, completely unaware I was going to wire every inch of it with legal explosives. "I will look into the regulations tonight," I said softly, keeping my head bowed so they could not see my eyes. "I will figure out a compliant way to process the settlement so Brielle is safe." "Good," my father said, turning on his heel. "We will expect your email with the instructions in the morning." They left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving me standing in the doorway holding the absurd legal threat they had paid some desperate attorney to draft. I closed the door slowly, the satisfying click of the deadbolt locking them out of my sanctuary. The trembling in my hands stopped instantly. My posture straightened. The manufactured fear vanished from my face, leaving behind nothing but cold, crystalline focus. I walked back to my living room, dropped their emergency motion next to my laptop, and sat down at my desk. They brought the court to my door, so I will pay them back with a dossier. 12 years ago. I was 22 years old and standing in the center of my childhood bedroom. My worn canvas suitcase was open on the bed. Half full of sensible, heavily discounted professional clothes I had spent months acquiring from local thrift stores. I had just secured a highly competitive summer internship with a top-tier corporate auditing firm 3 states away. It was my guaranteed ticket out of our suffocating household. It was the only thing I had ever asked my parents to help me finance. Just a temporary bridge loan of $2,500 to cover my initial out-of-state rent and a security deposit until my first official paycheck cleared the bank. They had told me they would think about it. I had taken that as a tentative yes. Then, my mother walked into my room. She did not look at my packed bags or the stack of acceptance letters neatly arranged on my desk. She simply dropped a glossy, heavy stock brochure and a perfectly pressed invoice right on top of my folded shirts. The total balance printed at the bottom of the page was for $6,800. It was an invoice for an exclusive 6-month intensive personal branding and elite media etiquette course for my younger sister. Brielle had just been chosen as a fresh face for a questionable local talent agency that promised to mold her into a regional lifestyle influencer. My father stepped into the doorway behind my mother, effectively blocking my exit. He looked at the staggering invoice on my bed, and then he looked directly into my eyes. "We are pulling your relocation funding," he stated, his voice carrying the casual weight of a man canceling a magazine subscription. "You need to formally withdraw from the out-of-state internship program and enroll in the local community college down the road. You can pick up night shifts at the diner to pay your own tuition." When I stood there, paralyzed by the sudden collapse of my entire carefully planned future and asked them why, my mother delivered the exact phrase that would become the governing constitution of our family dynamic for the next decade. "You need to be realistic, Paisley," she sighed, brushing a piece of lint off her pristine cardigan. "The family only has one person with a highly marketable future. Your sister is a visual investment. You are just going to be a background employee. We have to allocate our financial resources where they will yield the absolute highest return for the family brand." I did not argue. I did not cry in front of them. I waited until they walked downstairs to eat dinner, and then I quietly unpacked my suitcase. I folded my thrift store blouses and put them back into my dresser drawers. I stayed in our hometown. I worked 2 grueling jobs while taking full course loads at night, paying for every single textbook, every credit hour, and every tank of gas out of my own desperately scraped-together wages. Through that isolation, I learned exactly how to become invisible. I learned that surviving inside my family required keeping my head down, keeping my mouth entirely shut, and building my own escape routes in absolute, impenetrable secrecy. While I learned to build, Brielle learned to extract. She grew up fundamentally believing that other people's money was simply a natural, renewable resource that she was divinely entitled to harvest. If she overspent her monthly clothing allowance by hundreds of dollars, the deficit was magically covered by our father. If she ruined her vehicle because she refused to pay for routine maintenance, a newer, cleaner car simply appeared in the driveway the following week. She never once experienced the agonizing friction of a real consequence. My parents conditioned her to deeply believe that whenever she recklessly jumped out of an airplane, someone else would always be legally obligated to hand her a parachute on her way down. I found out exactly how deep that toxic conditioning went a few years later. I was 24, applying for my very first independent apartment lease across town. When the property manager called to inform me my background check had been flagged, I immediately requested my official credit report and sat at my cheap kitchen table. Staring in horror at the printed pages, there were 3 severely delinquent accounts I had never opened: a high-speed internet account, a premium television cable package, and a luxury family cell phone plan. All 3 were inextricably tied to my social security number. All 3 bore my exact legal name, and all 3 were officially registered to my parents' home address. When I drove back to their house and confronted them with the highlighted credit report, I naively expected denial, or at least a flicker of shame. Instead, I received blatant, defensive irritation. "We are just borrowing your credit score temporarily," my mother said, waving her hand dismissively while flipping through a catalog on the living room sofa. "Your father had a slight dip in his rating because of Brielle's studio deposit, and she absolutely needed the upgraded phone lines for her modeling portfolio networking. We will pay the balance back when things settle down financially. Stop making such a massive, dramatic deal out of family members quietly helping each other." They never paid a single cent back. The accounts eventually went to third-party collections. I spent 2 entire years aggressively paying down thousands of dollars of high-interest debt that rightfully belonged to the exact people who were supposed to protect me, just so I could restore my own ruined credit score and rent a decent apartment. I did not scream at them. I did not throw ceramic plates against the kitchen wall. I did not storm out of the house and declare a theatrical, tearful estrangement. I knew that emotional explosions only leave a mess, and messes only leave you vulnerable to further manipulation. Instead, I fully internalized the lesson. I became a silent, meticulous human ledger. I started keeping permanent records of absolutely everything: every discarded utility bill, every casual financial lie, every redirected dollar, and every forged signature. I watched them operate from the shadows, studying their specific methods of emotional extortion and financial parasitism the exact same way a forensic biologist studies a mutating virus under a microscope. They looked at my quiet compliance and mistook my silence for weak submission. They never once realized that my silence was actually highly calculated surveillance. I was gathering the data required to ensure they could never trap me again. I do not hate my sister. I really do not. I just absolutely despise the parasitic ecosystem that groomed her into a professional victim, and the system that continuously tried to turn me into her personal trash filter. I stood in the center of my living room, the heavy legal motion resting against my palms. The air in the apartment felt thick, suffocating under the weight of their collective expectations. I knew that if I simply refused them outright, they would immediately escalate the situation. My father would hire more aggressive counsel, and my mother would begin a relentless campaign of social assassination among our extended relatives, painting me as the villain who let her own flesh and blood perish. I had to pivot away from a direct confrontation. I had to make them believe they were the architects of their own financial salvation. If I am going to facilitate this, I began, pitching my voice to sound appropriately anxious and defeated, we have to execute a perfectly clean solution. My mother crossed her arms tightly, her manicured fingernails tapping impatiently against her expensive silk blouse. Clean means fast, she snapped, her eyes narrowing. We do not have time for your usual bureaucratic obsession. Just authorize the bank release. Fast is exactly what gets accounts frozen permanently, I countered, widening my eyes to feign genuine panic. I looked directly at Brielle, whose face was a chaotic mask of smeared cosmetics and sheer terror. If I simply execute a direct unverified wire transfer of $140,000 into a failing business account, the federal banking algorithms will flag it as suspicious activity within 2 seconds. They will lock my account. They will lock your account, and the money will sit in administrative purgatory for 6 months while investigators dig through your studio records. Is that what you want? Brielle gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth. No, they cannot freeze it. The vendors are threatening to call the police on Monday morning. I need the cash liquid. Exactly, I said, my voice softening into a tone of protective sisterhood that made my own stomach physically turn. That is why we have to route the funds through a structured escrow agreement. It creates a legitimate, legally binding protective shield around the transaction. It proves to the court, the auditors, and your angry creditors that this is a formalized family settlement, not a desperate attempt to hide personal assets. I proposed a comprehensive family settlement package. I explained that it would require a formal memorandum of understanding, a detailed repayment schedule spanning 48 months, and the notarized signatures of all 3 of them. It sounded incredibly robust. It sounded entirely beneficial to their cause. It was, in reality, a meticulously crafted trap designed to lock them into a series of binding, written admissions of guilt, to sell the illusion of compliance. I walked over to the coffee table, opened my laptop, and began drafting a template email right in front of them. My father hovered aggressively over my left shoulder, his heavy breathing a constant, oppressive rhythm against my neck. I deliberately populated the email draft with dense, intimidating corporate terminology. I typed out long, convoluted phrases regarding structured indemnification, fiduciary disbursement protocols, and reciprocal liability shielding. I knew for an absolute fact that neither of my parents nor my sister possessed the basic financial literacy to comprehend a single paragraph I was typing. But I also knew their immense pride would prevent them from ever asking for clarification. They would read the complex vocabulary and arrogantly assume it meant I was utilizing my corporate expertise to build them an impenetrable fortress. I paused my typing and looked up, allowing a small, convincing frown to crease my forehead. There is one crucial variable we need to iron out before I finalize the compliance routing, I murmured, keeping my tone conversational and utterly unthreatening. Since you already filed an injunction, the presiding judge is going to inevitably review the origin of the deficit. We have to align our wording perfectly before we submit anything. What is the official, documented reason we are providing for the sudden capital shortfall in the studio? The room went completely still for 3 seconds. My parents exchanged a rapid, uneasy glance, clearly completely out of their depth. Brielle, however, was running entirely on pure adrenaline and sheer desperation. Her mouth moved long before her brain could engage its self-preservation filters. The same cash flow overlap she'd admitted in my living room, Brielle blurted out, waving her hand in the air as if swatting away a minor, insignificant annoyance. I used the incoming venue deposits from the new brides booking for next year to pay off the caterers and event rental companies from the weddings that happened last season. It was just rolling the cash over to keep the studio operational. But then 2 of the major venues canceled their contracts unexpectedly. And now the new clients are demanding their deposits back all at once. I kept my face utterly blank. I did not let my jaw tighten. I did not let my eyes widen. Inside the silent, secure theater of my mind, however, a massive iron vault slammed decisively shut. She had just handed me the absolute, undeniable weapon by casually admitting she used new client deposits to pay old business debts. She had verbally confessed to the deliberate commingling of funds and the gross misuse of fiduciary deposits. It was textbook, prosecutable fraud. That single, careless sentence was enough to completely incinerate any shred of credibility she might attempt to present in a courtroom. My father, sensing the conversation drifting into dangerous territory, slammed his heavy palm against the back of the sofa. "Enough with the corporate interrogation," he ordered, his voice echoing sharply off the living room walls. "Just authorize the transfer forms right now. We need the capital secured tonight. Stop stalling and move the cash." I shook my head vigorously, projecting a look of absolute, terrified compliance. "I physically cannot do it tonight," I insisted, my voice rising an octave to simulate stress. A midnight wire transfer of that magnitude without an established, verified escrow protocol will trigger an automatic security lock from the fraud department. I need 24 hours for the compliance team to clear the routing path. I will send you the finalized document package with the exact signing instructions tomorrow morning. If you sign them immediately, the funds will clear by the afternoon. They hesitated. I could see the greed violently battling the ignorance behind my father's eyes. Greed won, as it always inevitably did with them. They accepted the delay, fully believing they had successfully bullied me into opening my vault. When they finally turned and walked out my front door, I stood in the center of the room and listened to their heavy footsteps fade down the long hallway. I didn't cry. I didn't even sit down. I went straight to the laptop and built the Round Rock file. The apartment was completely silent except for the low, steady hum of my refrigerator and the rapid clicking of my computer mouse. I had told my family I needed 24 hours to set up an appropriate escrow account for my sister. I actually needed those exact hours to build an airtight defensive perimeter. The first rule of forensic compliance is simple but absolute. If a subject is confidently lying about one major financial anomaly, they are already actively hiding 3 more behind your back. I opened a secure, encrypted browser window and initiated a comprehensive, multi-bureau pull of my entire credit history. I did not just look at the high-level summary score that most people check. I bypassed the consumer dashboard completely and downloaded the raw, unformatted data logs. My eyes tracked down the long columns of active trade lines. Right there, buried under my legitimate mortgage and standard car payments, were 2 unsecured consumer loans. Both accounts had been opened within the last 18 months. Both were entirely in my legal name. Further down the heavily detailed report, a revolving retail credit account glared back at me from the screen. I clicked into the specific transaction history for that card. My breath caught in my throat. Not out of panic, but out of a sharp, clinical disgust. The line items painted a vivid, undeniable picture of exactly where the money had gone. There were massive, consecutive charges for a high-end sectional sofa and custom dining chairs from a luxury furniture retailer. Directly below those entries were authorizations for an oceanfront resort down in Florida, along with heavy charges for premium dining, spa treatments, and water sports rentals. I clearly remembered that specific week from last summer. My mother had posted dozens of photos online of their beautiful family vacation, a trip they explicitly told me they could not invite me on because they supposedly secured a last-minute couples package. Brielle had been featured in every single picture. sitting on the very paddleboards my stolen credit identity had secretly funded. I did not react emotionally. I compartmentalized the visceral betrayal and went straight to work. I transformed my quiet dining table into a corporate war room. I downloaded every single monthly statement linked to the fraudulent accounts. I saved the files as secure digital documents. I took time-stamped screenshots of the electronic payment authorizations. I opened a new blank spreadsheet and began constructing a chronological timeline, meticulously matching their publicly documented vacation dates against the fraudulent transaction dates. It was no longer a messy family dispute. It was a formal, structured audit, and I was building an impenetrable chain of evidence. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the toll-free customer service number listed on the fraudulent credit card account. I bypassed the automated voice system and demanded a live representative, using my legal name, my date of birth, and my social security number. I answered their security verification questions effortlessly. I maintained a calm, pleasant tone and asked the representative to simply verify the primary mailing address where the physical paper statements were currently being sent. The woman on the line cheerfully read back my parents' exact street address, right down to the specific postal code. They were deliberately intercepting the mail so I would never see the paper trail of their theft. But the most alarming discovery was buried deep inside a municipal public records database. I ran my own name through the county tax assessor portal, just to be absolutely thorough with my background check. A residential property tax account immediately popped up on the screen. My father had actively listed me as the primary alternate contact and financial guarantor for their home property taxes. It was a completely unnecessary administrative move, unless they were quietly setting up the legal framework to make me personally liable for their inevitable municipal defaults. I leaned back in my desk chair, staring blankly at the glowing dual monitors. The scattered pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The emergency court motion they had aggressively shoved into my chest earlier that night was not just a desperate grab for my savings account. It was a massive escalation of a long-term strategy. They did not just want my liquid money. They wanted total encompassing control over my entire financial identity. They were trying to establish a permanent legal precedent indicating that my personal assets were inextricably linked to their endless liabilities. I pushed my chair away from the desk and walked straight down the hallway to my storage closet. Pushed into the very back corner, hidden behind heavy winter coats and dusty holiday decorations, was a reinforced plastic tote box. It held old tax returns, expired passports, and various legal documents from my early 20s. I dragged the heavy box out into the hallway, unlatched the plastic top, and began digging through the densely packed folders. Near the very bottom, my fingers brushed against thick, textured parchment. I pulled out a heavy manila envelope. The flap was tightly sealed with aged adhesive and stamped with a faded, official notary seal. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable, sharp handwriting, were 3 specific words: quitclaim, file copy. I froze completely. The air in the narrow hallway suddenly felt incredibly thin. Because of my extensive corporate background, I knew exactly what a quitclaim deed was. I dealt with complex asset transfers on a daily basis, but I could not fathom any logical reason why my father would have one locked in a file with my name on it, sitting completely untouched in my possession for years. I held the heavy envelope in both of my hands. My immediate burning instinct was to tear the flap open right then and there, to consume whatever massive secret was hiding inside the parchment. But the seasoned forensic auditor inside my brain knew much better. You absolutely never open the critical piece of evidence until you have your legal counsel present to properly establish an unbroken chain of custody. I walked back into the living room and placed the sealed envelope gently on my desk, right next to the thick stack of printed, fraudulent credit reports. I picked up my phone and searched through my professional network contacts. I scrolled until I found the direct cellular number for Grant Holloway. He was a ruthless, highly specialized civil litigation attorney based out of Austin, known specifically for aggressively dismantling complex asset protection schemes and prosecuting financial abuse. The phone rang exactly twice before his deep, raspy voice answered the line. I did not introduce myself. I did not offer any polite pleasantries or long, winding background stories about my family trauma. I just stared intensely at the sealed envelope sitting on my desk and delivered the only sentence that mattered. They dragged the court to my house. I need you to drag the truth to the court. The weekend vanished into a blur of scanning documents and building encrypted timelines. By Monday afternoon, the promised compliance routing forms had not materialized in my parents' inboxes, simply because Grant Holloway had explicitly forbidden me from sending anything without his direct oversight. My family did not wait to ask why I was delaying. They went entirely nuclear. Before I had even finished my afternoon coffee, a process server in a wrinkled gray suit knocked on my door and handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside was a formal application for a temporary restraining order against my own bank accounts. My parents and their desperate lawyer had officially petitioned the county judge to freeze every single asset I owned. Reading through the sworn declarations was like reading a bizarre alternate universe fiction novel. My father had literally testified under oath that my hard-earned savings account was actually a communal family fund. He used the exact phrase spiritually managed, his way of saying he oversaw my money without proof to describe his non-existent oversight of my finances. Claiming that since I was a teenager, I had implicitly agreed to hold this money for the collective benefit of the household. It was a staggering leap of logic, attempting to legally transform his emotional dominance into actual financial ownership. Attached right behind my father's delusion was a signed, notarized affidavit from Brielle. She brazenly claimed that I had firmly promised her the cash to save her failing business, but had suddenly changed my mind during our Friday night confrontation. She wrote that I was exhibiting highly erratic behavior, emotional instability, and a severe detachment from reality. They were legally painting me as a financially reckless, mentally unstable hoarder who could not be trusted with her own money. The worst part was the timeline. Because they had successfully claimed I was a major flight risk who might liquidate and hide the assets out of pure spite, the court granted an expedited preliminary hearing. I had exactly 72 hours to prepare. It was a classic fast-track legal ambush designed to induce maximum panic and force a rapid, messy settlement before the defending party could properly arm themselves. I did not panic. Panic is an emotion, and forensic auditors do not operate on emotion. We operate on strict protocol. I scanned and forwarded the entire legal packet to Grant. His response was immediate and terrifyingly calm. He instructed me to lock down every single avenue of verbal communication. If my parents called, I was to let it go to voicemail. If Brielle texted, I was to take a screenshot and ignore it. I was strictly forbidden from speaking a single syllable to them unless it was documented, time-stamped, and routed through a verifiable digital channel. Silence was no longer just my defense mechanism. It was now my primary legal strategy. Realizing that their courtroom ambush had not resulted in me immediately begging for mercy over the phone. My family pivoted their strategy. They moved from the legal arena to the community. My cell phone started lighting up with incoming messages from aunts, uncles, and older cousins I had not spoken to in several years. My mother had clearly spent her entire afternoon making the rounds. The narrative she spun was a masterpiece of manipulative victimhood. She told everyone that I was hoarding a massive, unexpected windfall while actively watching my little sister face complete bankruptcy and potential jail time. I was successfully framed as the greedy, heartless corporate monster who had abandoned her own flesh and blood over petty childhood resentments. I read the hateful text messages from my extended family, feeling a dull, heavy ache in my chest, but I deleted every single one without responding. Arguing with her enablers would only fuel the smear campaign. Their absolute lowest blow came at 8 o'clock on Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my kitchen island, organizing the downloaded credit card statements into chronological binders for Grant, when two uniformed city police officers arrived at my front door. They were conducting a formal welfare check. According to the officers, my parents had frantically called the non-emergency dispatch line, claiming I had sent them disturbing messages and was exhibiting signs of severe panic and potential self-harm. They told the police I was locked in my apartment and having a massive mental breakdown over a family financial dispute. I opened the door wide, letting the bright hallway light spill into my meticulously clean, perfectly quiet apartment. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive, outraged, or hysterical. I smiled politely, offered the officers bottled water, and stepped aside so they could see the neat stacks of organized paperwork on my counter. By pure, fortunate coincidence, my elderly neighbor from across the hall was stepping out to walk her dog. She stopped, leaning heavily on her cane, and loudly informed the officers that I was the quietest, most stable tenant in the entire building and that she had just seen me bringing in my groceries completely fine 2 hours prior. I calmly explained to the officers that I was simply in the middle of a civil litigation dispute with my estranged parents, and that they were attempting to use the police department to artificially generate a public record of mental instability for their upcoming court hearing. The older officer sighed, clearly recognizing a weaponized family dispute when he saw one. He took down my neighbor's statement, handed me his card, and apologized profusely for the intrusion. The second the patrol car drove away from the curb, I emailed the incident report details to Grant. He was absolutely furious. He immediately filed a formal notice of documented harassment with the opposing counsel, explicitly warning them that any further abuse of municipal emergency services would result in us seeking an immediate, permanent no-contact order. He told me they were desperately trying to build a paper trail of my alleged instability to justify taking total control of my life. I walked back to my kitchen island and looked at the glowing digital calendar on my laptop screen. The expedited hearing was scheduled for Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Staring at the bold red appointment block, the final piece of their strategy clicked perfectly into place. They did not just want to win the motion to steal my savings, they wanted me fundamentally humiliated. They wanted my reputation entirely destroyed. They wanted me publicly branded as the unstable, unreliable daughter so that nobody would ever believe a single word I said about their years of profound financial abuse. They wanted to strip away my credibility so I could never fight back again. A cold, profound sense of clarity washed over me, completely erasing whatever lingering guilt I still held about fighting my own blood. I closed my calendar application and opened the encrypted folder containing the fraudulent credit logs and the unread quitclaim deed. Fine. I whispered to the empty room. If they want to drag my name through the mud in front of a judge, then I will let the court see exactly who the real fabricators are. If you want to win fast, and win permanently, Grant Holloway told me over our secure line on Wednesday morning, you cannot just play defense. You have to hand them the rope and let them tie their own hands. We need something that forces them into a corner, completely trapped under their own signatures. I knew exactly what kind of bait would work. Their blinding desperation for my money had completely short-circuited their ability to think critically. I sat at my dining table, opened my laptop, and finalized the document package I had casually mentioned to them during their ambush at my apartment. I titled it, The Family Escrow Packet. I drafted a highly formal, carefully structured email to my parents and sister. I adopted a tone of weary compliance. I explained that because they had aggressively involved the legal system and secured a temporary freeze on my assets, the presiding judge would now demand absolute, documented transparency before authorizing any release of the preserved funds. I told them this specific packet was a standard compliance procedure required to satisfy the court regarding the exact nature of Brielle's financial shortfall, and to formally clear the runway for the money to be routed into a secure escrow channel. The trap I designed consisted of 2 highly specific documents, both expertly disguised as tedious administrative boilerplate. The first document was designated as an acknowledgement of source and use of funds. It looked exactly like a standard corporate intake questionnaire, complete with small print and official-looking formatting. I explicitly designed a mandatory disclosure section for Brielle to explain the origin of her capital deficit. I knew she wanted the money so intensely that she would try to over-explain her situation to make herself look like a responsible, hard-working business owner navigating a minor. Temporary rough patch. She took the bait flawlessly. When she returned her scanned portion of the document, She had handwritten a densely packed paragraph directly into the provided lines. In her own handwriting, she admitted that she had intentionally diverted incoming venue deposits from future clients to pay off aggressive, overdue vendors from the previous business year. She even added extra, self-righteous sentences justifying the action as standard industry cash flow management. By trying to look competent, she had just formally documented her own blatant corporate fraud and signed her legal name at the very bottom. The second document in the package was constructed entirely for my parents. I titled it an authorization history statement. The preamble falsely stated that to clear the court's hold, we needed to legally establish a documented history of our shared family financial trust to prove our pooling of resources. The core of the document asked them to formally confirm that they had previously operated credit accounts, utilized retail financing, or managed municipal property obligations under my name with my explicit, verbal permission. They signed it without a single moment of hesitation. They genuinely believed that by signing that specific page, they were providing the judge with bulletproof evidence of their fabricated family fund theory, which would force the immediate release of my savings. In reality, they were legally admitting in writing to opening those specific fraudulent accounts in my name. Furthermore, they were completely trapping themselves by placing the entire burden of proof squarely on their own shoulders. They would now have to produce a written authorization document from me to justify their actions. A document that simply did not exist. They had just handed me a signed confession to identity theft. Within 3 hours of sending my initial email, the fully executed, signed digital documents landed squarely in my inbox. They did not ask a single question about the dense legal terminology or the implications of what they were signing. They just wanted the cash. I did not initiate any banking wire transfers. I did not contact my financial institution. Instead, I carefully downloaded the signed documents and extracted the raw, underlying email metadata to decisively prove exactly when and from which specific Internet protocol addresses the files were sent. I forwarded the entire encrypted bundle directly to Grant and saved 3 separate backup copies on offline, encrypted hard drives. Grant called me exactly 10 minutes later. I could hear a low, sharp whistle through the receiver. "This is catastrophic for them," he said, his voice laced with pure professional admiration. "They just gave us a signed confession, complete with their fingerprints pressed incredibly deep into the handle, with their signed confessions firmly secured in our arsenal." Grant immediately began preparing our devastating counterattack. He drafted a formal motion to compel, demanding that the opposing counsel produce tangible, material evidence of the imaginary family fund my parents had sworn existed under oath. He was demanding bank statements, historical trust documents, and signed mutual agreements. He was demanding things they absolutely could not produce, with the legal snare perfectly set and the courtroom showdown looming just 48 hours away. I finally allowed myself to step away from the glowing monitors. My apartment was utterly quiet, the frantic, buzzing energy of the past few days finally settling into a cold, highly calculated calm. I walked slowly over to my desk. The heavy manila envelope I had pulled from my storage closet days ago was still sitting exactly where I had left it. The faded notary stamp practically glowed against the dark wood of my desk. I had waited patiently for Grant to give me the definitive green light to review my own historical records, ensuring I did not compromise any chain of custody rules. I sat down in my chair, picked up a heavy steel letter opener, and carefully sliced through the aged, yellowing adhesive of the flap. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of stapled, legal-sized parchment. The official header indicated it was a property transfer document filed over a decade ago. I scanned past the complex legal descriptions of land tracts, municipal zoning codes, and surveyor notes, my eyes rapidly searching for the core of the agreement. I found the section detailing the specific transferring parties. I saw my father's signature, sharp, aggressive, and arrogant, listed boldly under the grantor line. Then, I moved my index finger down to the very next section of the page. The breath physically left my lungs in a sudden rush, leaving me completely frozen in the heavy silence of my living room. There, printed in bold, undeniable black ink, was a single line that completely shifted the gravitational pull of my entire reality. Grantee, Paisley Reed. I stared at the heavy black ink spelling out my legal name across the grantee line. My mind snapped backward exactly 11 years. I was 21 years old. Sitting at the polished kitchen island of the house I grew up in, my father was pacing the hardwood floor, aggressively chewing on a toothpick, a nervous habit he only displayed when his money was in jeopardy. He was facing a massive liability lawsuit from a disgruntled subcontractor at his former commercial development firm. He was absolutely terrified of losing his personal assets to a massive civil judgment. He had slammed a thick stack of papers down in front of me along with a blue ballpoint pen. He told me it was simply a routine, mandatory update for the homeowner hazard insurance policy. He claimed the insurance broker needed an adult dependent listed on the property file to secure a lower annual premium. I did not understand real estate law or asset protection trusts. I just knew that questioning his authority resulted in weeks of psychological punishment and endless screaming. So, I obediently signed my name exactly where his thick finger pointed. A notary public, an old golfing buddy of his who owed him a favor, stamped the pages without ever once asking me if I actually understood what I was legally executing. By filing that quitclaim deed, my father had intentionally severed his legal ownership of the property to hide it from his corporate creditors, transferring the title entirely and permanently to me. When the subcontractor lawsuit eventually settled out of court a year later, my father never bothered to reverse the property transfer. He likely wanted to avoid paying the expensive county filing fees, or perhaps he just arrogantly assumed I would never possess the financial literacy or the courage to uncover his maneuver. For over a decade, my parents had paraded around that sprawling 4-bedroom colonial house acting like the absolute lords of the manor. They hosted lavish neighborhood holiday parties. They entirely remodeled the kitchen with expensive imported marble. They constantly demanded I take my shoes off at the front door to protect their precious, newly finished floors. Yet, according to the strict property laws of our state, they were nothing more than my long-term, non-paying tenants. I had known that heavy envelope was sitting in my storage box for years, but I had intentionally developed a protective, selective amnesia about its actual contents. I never once considered using it as a weapon of retaliation against them. I treated that document as my ultimate, impenetrable suit of armor, desperately praying I would never actually be forced to put it on. I just wanted to live my quiet, entirely separate life, but they had forced my hand by bringing the court to my front door. I placed the fragile parchment onto my flatbed scanner, digitized the pages in ultra-high resolution, and securely transmitted the encrypted file directly to Grant Holloway. My phone rang less than 20 minutes later. I just pulled the municipal tax records and the official county clerk registry, Grant said, his voice entirely devoid of his usual sarcastic edge. The gravity of the discovery had shifted his tone into pure predatory focus. The deed was recorded flawlessly. The notary stamp is completely valid and historically verified. There are 0 outstanding liens on the property. Paisley, you own the ground they are sleeping on. 100%. I do not want to send them to federal prison. Grant, I whispered, the crushing reality of the situation making my throat feel incredibly tight. I do not want them arrested for bank fraud or perjury. I just want them to drop the injunction, release my bank accounts, and leave me alone forever. Listen to me very carefully, Grant replied, his tone hardening into absolute, unwavering professional authority. Predators do not stop hunting just because the prey politely asks them to walk away. They stop when the toll for crossing the bridge becomes far too expensive to pay. If you want them to stop permanently, you have to show them the agonizing price of their actions. We spent the next 3 hours finalizing our devastating legal counterstrike over the secure phone line. We were no longer simply preparing a defensive response to defeat their emergency motion for my savings account. Grant was drafting a massive, comprehensive countersuit. We were going to officially charge them with severe identity misuse, malicious legal prosecution, and sustained harassment. We were legally tying their fraudulent credit card statements directly to the fake family trust narrative they had just sworn to under oath. Finally, we were demanding an ironclad, permanent no-contact order to sever them from my life forever. "When we walk into that hearing on Friday morning," Grant instructed firmly, dictating the absolute rules of engagement, "you will be a statue. You will not argue with your father. You will not look at your mother when she inevitably starts sobbing to manipulate the presiding judge. You will not tell any long, tragic stories about how unfairly they treated you as a teenager. The judge does not care about your hurt feelings. The judge only cares about the physical, verifiable evidence. We let the paper trail bleed them entirely dry." I agreed, ending the call and slowly closing my laptop. I sat alone in the profound, heavy silence of my apartment, watching the distant city lights reflect off my living room window. The rapid, anxious beating of my heart had completely steadied. I finally understood the absolute magnitude of what was about to happen inside that courtroom. My family had dragged me into a vicious legal battle solely to rip the savings out of my bank account. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a perpetual, useful victim who would always surrender to keep the peace. But as I looked at the digitized property deed glowing softly on my secondary monitor, I realized the absolute truth. The thing I was about to take back from them was not just my money. I was about to take back an entire lifetime of being severely disrespected. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung shut behind me on Friday morning. The air inside the courtroom smelled of stale floor wax and nervous sweat. I sat rigidly at the polished defense table next to Grant Holloway. My parents, Brielle, and their hired attorney sat just a few feet away at the petitioner table. They refused to make eye contact with me, projecting an aura of wounded righteousness. Before the presiding judge even had a chance to fully review the case file, Grant stood up. His voice was exceptionally polite, but carried a sharp, metallic edge. He formally requested that a certified court reporter be brought in and that the entire proceeding be subjected to full, uninterrupted audio recording. He wanted every single syllable uttered in that room permanently etched into the legal public record. The judge nodded and ordered the clerk to start the recording. Everyone in the room who intended to speak was formally sworn in under penalty of perjury. The lawyer my parents had hired stood up first. He launched into a dramatic, highly rehearsed opening statement. He did not talk about banking regulations or legal precedents. He attacked my character directly. He painted me as an incredibly selfish, deeply manipulative individual suffering from an obsessive need for financial control. He argued that because I was allegedly hoarding a communal family fund out of petty spite, the court desperately needed to intervene and appoint my parents as temporary financial conservators to rescue my sister. My mother took her cue perfectly. She dabbed her eyes with a pristine white tissue, letting out a soft, rehearsed sob. She looked directly at the judge and spun a tragic tale. Claiming I had been emotionally cold and distant since childhood, she masterfully attempted to twist a straightforward financial theft into a heartbreaking moral failing on my part. Brielle spoke next, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. She looked at the bench and insisted she had simply experienced a minor, unforeseeable business accident. She begged the judge for one last chance to save her studio, swearing under oath that I had explicitly promised her the capital before suddenly changing my mind in a fit of manic paranoia. I sat perfectly still, exactly as Grant had instructed. I did not shake my head. I did not glare at them. I let them build their towering house of cards right in the middle of the courtroom. When it was Grant's turn to cross-examine, he did not immediately object to their ridiculous character assassinations. He walked slowly toward the witness stand, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He asked a few remarkably short, incredibly simple questions designed exclusively to lock their lies into the permanent transcript. "Miss Brielle," Grant began, his tone gentle, almost conversational, "could you clarify for the court exactly where your business shortfall originated? Who knew about this deficit, and who controls the operational paperwork for your studio?" "It was just a cash flow overlap," Brielle answered quickly, eager to sound professional and in control. "I manage all the paperwork. I just moved some client deposits around to cover operating costs from previous events." Grant nodded slowly. Offering no judgment, he pivoted his attention to my father. "Sir, you stated earlier that you are the primary manager of the family assets, which you claim includes my client's savings. As the head of this family, do you control the primary assets? The real estate?" My father puffed out his chest, his immense pride completely overriding any basic legal caution. He leaned forward into the microphone, his voice booming with arrogant certainty. "I control it all. I own the family home, I manage our real estate equity, and I have the absolute right to manage and direct all related financial assets for the survival of this family." "Thank you," Grant said quietly. He walked back to our table and picked up 3 thick, neatly bound folders. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit Exhibits A, B, and C into evidence." Grant handed a copy of the family escrow packet to the judge and another copy to the opposing counsel. He directed the court's attention to the specific pages containing Brielle's handwritten confession regarding the commingling of client funds, and my parents' signed authorization admitting they utilized my identity for their credit accounts. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. I watched Brielle's face drain of all color as she stared down at the exact paragraph she had confidently written just 2 days prior. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. She realized instantly that she had handed a legally binding confession of corporate fraud directly to a presiding judge. The judge frowned deeply, pushing his reading glasses up the bridge of his nose as he scanned the documents. He ordered a brief, 10-minute recess to fully review the submitted evidence. During the break, my parents remained seated at their table. At first, my father looked mildly annoyed, assuming this was just a minor bureaucratic delay, but then their attorney leaned in violently. His face was flushed red with absolute fury. He began stabbing his index finger repeatedly at the signatures on the documents, his voice a harsh, angry whisper. My mother's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The arrogant certainty evaporated from my father's posture, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization. They had blindly signed legal instruments without reading the fine print, believing it was just a technicality to release my money. Now they were beginning to panic as their own lawyer explained they had practically indicted themselves. When the judge returned to the bench, the entire atmosphere of the room had shifted from a civil family dispute to a severe legal inquiry. The judge looked down at my family with an expression of profound, chilling skepticism. Before the judge could issue a ruling on the emergency injunction, Grant stood up again. He reached into his leather briefcase and retrieved a single, thin piece of heavily textured parchment. "Your Honor," Grant said, his voice ringing with absolute authority across the quiet courtroom. "Regarding the petitioner's sworn testimony from just a few moments ago regarding his total ownership and control of the family estate." Grant walked forward and placed Exhibit D directly onto the judge's wooden bench. "Before the court renders any final decision regarding the petitioner's request to seize my client's life savings," Grant stated, staring directly at my father, "please allow me to read a very brief, legally binding statement regarding the actual, verified ownership of the property." My father did not wait for his own legal counsel to formulate a coherent objection. The heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the polished courtroom floor as he shot to his feet. His face was a mottled, furious red, the veins in his thick neck bulging against the tight collar of his stiff white dress shirt. "This is completely irrelevant," my father roared, his deep voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceiling of the municipal building. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at Grant. "This entire hearing is exclusively about my daughter's bank accounts. It is about the family savings. The real estate has absolutely nothing to do with this injunction. He is wasting the court's time." The opposing attorney scrambled to stand, desperately grabbing at the hem of my father's suit jacket to pull him back down into his seat. But the damage was already done. The outburst hung in the air, a desperate attempt to maintain his lifelong pattern of loud, aggressive dominance. Grant Holloway did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to match my father's shouting. He simply turned his body to face the high wooden bench, his posture completely relaxed, holding the thin piece of parchment loosely in his left hand. The contrast between my father's erratic fury and Grant's chilling composure was absolute. "Your Honor," Grant said, his tone as smooth and cold as a sheet of winter ice. "The petitioner's entire claim to my client's private savings relies specifically on the sworn premise that he acts as the central financial authority of a shared family estate. He just testified under penalty of perjury that he manages the overarching family assets, specifically including the primary residence, as absolute proof of this patriarchal authority. Therefore, the actual, verified legal ownership of that specific property is directly relevant to establishing both his underlying motive and his fundamental credibility before this court." The judge stared down from the elevated bench, his expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial authority. He looked at my father, who was still standing, breathing heavily, trapped suddenly between his own towering arrogance and a creeping, unfamiliar sense of dread. The silence in the room stretched out, punctuated only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's stenography machine capturing every single spoken syllable. "You opened the door to this specific line of inquiry during your own voluntary testimony, sir," the judge stated firmly, pointing his wooden gavel down at my father. "Sit down immediately." The judge then turned his attention back to my attorney, giving a short, sharp nod. "You may read the document. Counselor, proceed." As my father slowly sank back into his chair, a heavy, suffocating silence descended over the courtroom again. It was a silence so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The air conditioning hummed faintly in the background, a low drone that only amplified the extreme tension radiating from the petitioner's table. I turned my head slightly and looked directly across the wide aisle. My mother was staring openly at me. Her perfectly powdered face had gone completely slack, her carefully maintained veneer of victimhood entirely dissolving. For 34 years, she had only ever looked at me as an extension of herself. I was an obedient tool to be used, a background character existing solely to facilitate their comfort and absorb their mistakes. But in that agonizing, silent moment, the lifelong illusion permanently shattered. She looked at me as if she were seeing a complete stranger sitting in my chair. She was staring at a woman who no longer needed to ask for permission to simply exist. She saw the absolute rigidity in my spine, and the total, terrifying lack of mercy in my eyes. I was no longer the family bank. I was the executioner of their falsehoods. Beside her, Brielle leaned forward over the heavy wooden table. Her hands were visibly shaking, her manicured fingers entirely white at the knuckles as she gripped the polished edge of the wood. The reality of the legal snare was finally piercing through her dense cloud of entitlement. "What are you doing?" Brielle hissed, her voice a frantic, breathy whisper that barely carried across the few feet of open space separating our tables. "Paisley, what is he holding? Tell him to stop right now." I did not blink. I did not turn my head toward her. I simply shifted my gaze forward, locking my eyes entirely on the blind scales of justice carved into the wooden seal above the judge's head. I owed them absolutely nothing, not my money, not my protection, and certainly not a comforting explanation. The time for private family negotiations had ended the exact second they handed me a subpoena. Grant stepped slowly up to the wooden podium positioned in the center of the room. He placed the verified copy of the deed flat on the surface, smoothing out the edges with the palm of his hand. He looked up, his eyes locking directly onto my father like a marksman lining up a final shot. "Let us ensure the official record is absolutely clear before we proceed any further," Grant began, phrasing his words with surgical precision. "Sir, just a few moments ago, you testified under oath that you are the sole legal owner of the primary family residence. You stated definitively that you own the equity, you control the physical property, and you possess the absolute legal right to manage it. Is that correct?" My father adjusted his silk tie, his jaw muscles clenching tightly beneath his skin. He was a man who had never been successfully challenged in his entire adult life. He simply could not fathom that the quiet daughter he had systematically terrorized for decades held the ultimate trump card. He truly believed his own infallible authority would somehow bend the legal reality to his will, just as it always had inside the walls of our house. "Yes," my father growled, his voice thick with defensive contempt and wounded pride. "Of course I own it. I bought the land. I paid for the construction. It is my house." Grant Holloway smiled. It was not a pleasant, reassuring expression. It was the terrifying, deeply satisfied smile of a seasoned predator watching the steel trap snap completely shut around its prey. Grant nodded slowly, deliberately tapping his index finger directly against the bottom paragraph of the digitized document resting on the podium. The sound of his fingernail hitting the paper echoed in the quiet room. "Then I respectfully ask the court to note for the official record," Grant announced, his voice ringing with devastating clarity, "that the petitioner has just blatantly committed perjury in your courtroom." The opposing attorney gasped loudly, half rising from his chair in a panic. My father's face drained of all its angry red color, leaving him a sickening, ashen shade of gray. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. The suffocating tension in the room ratcheted up so high it felt as though the air itself might spontaneously combust. The bomb had been armed, the timer had reached 0, and the entire room was holding its breath waiting for the detonation. The judge leaned completely forward over his high wooden desk, his eyes narrowing into dark, furious slits. He looked from Grant to my father, and then down to the single piece of paper lying on the podium. "Counselor," the judge ordered, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a sharpened steel blade. "Read the exact, verified name of the legal owner listed on that property deed." Grant Holloway did not hesitate. He looked directly at the presiding judge, his voice completely level and echoing with absolute finality. "Grantee, Paisley Reed." The moment those 4 words left his mouth, it was as if a massive vacuum had violently sucked all the oxygen out of the courtroom. My father collapsed back into his heavy wooden chair, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His jaw dropped open. A terrifying realization washed over his face, draining away decades of unchecked arrogance in a single, devastating second. He finally understood that the obscure paperwork he had aggressively forced me to sign over a decade ago to dodge a corporate liability lawsuit was not just a minor insurance technicality, it was a fully executed, legally binding transfer of his most valuable asset. The opposing attorney immediately shot up from his seat, his face flushed with sudden panic. "Objection, Your Honor, that document has to be an unrecorded copy. It is completely invalid and unenforceable if it was never properly filed with the county clerk." Grant calmly reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a secondary stack of papers, heavily stamped with official municipal seals. "I have the certified county clerk registry right here," Grant countered smoothly, handing the verified copies to the bailiff to pass up to the bench. The deed was officially recorded and permanently attached to the property title exactly 11 days after execution. Furthermore, I have the corresponding municipal property tax history proving my client has been the legally recognized owner of record for over 10 years. The property was transferred and processed with absolute, undeniable legal adherence. The judge meticulously reviewed the heavily stamped documents, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. He then slowly lowered the papers and glared down at my parents. The judicial fury in his eyes was absolute. "Sir," the judge began, his voice dropping into a dangerously quiet, commanding register, "you stood in my courtroom just 10 minutes ago and swore under penalty of perjury that you were the sole legal owner of that estate. You utilized that blatant lie as the entire foundational basis for demanding a financial conservatorship over your daughter. Since you have just actively committed perjury regarding your primary asset, this court has absolutely zero reason to believe a single syllable of your fabricated story about a shared family fund." The judge slammed his wooden gavel down onto the block. The sharp sound cracked through the silent room like a gunshot. "The emergency motion to seize the savings account of the defendant is entirely dismissed with prejudice," the judge declared firmly. "And I am issuing a formal warning to the petitioners. Utilizing the judicial system to financially extort a family member through blatantly fraudulent claims is a severe abuse of process. You are incredibly lucky I am not holding you in criminal contempt this very second. Before my parents could even process the devastating loss of their injunction, Grant moved in for the final, fatal strike. Your Honor, since the petitioners have already opened the door to their financial conduct under oath, Grant announced, the defense is officially filing a comprehensive civil countersuit. Grant proceeded to outline the exact evidence we had gathered over the weekend. He submitted the verified credit reports detailing the fraudulent accounts opened in my name. Then, he presented the final nail in the coffin, the family escrow packet. He directed the judge specifically to Brielle's handwritten admission of corporate fraud regarding her stolen client deposits, and my parents' signed authorization effectively confessing to the identity theft. The judge's face turned completely grim. He immediately ordered the opposing counsel to surrender all related financial records to the court for a comprehensive audit, officially opening the door for massive civil sanctions and potential criminal penalties against my entire family. Brielle let out a sharp, devastated sob, burying her face completely in her hands. She finally realized that in her desperate, greedy attempt to steal my money, she had just handed a judge the exact written confession needed to destroy her own life and business. They tried to destroy me, forgetting they'd put everything in writing. The opposing attorney looked completely defeated. He turned to Grant, his professional pride entirely shattered, and asked if there was any possible path to an immediate settlement before the court moved to formal prosecution. I placed my hand gently on Grant's forearm, signaling that I was ready to deliver the final terms. I looked directly across the aisle at the three people who had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable resource. I will drop the maximum civil penalties, I said, my voice cold, steady, and loud enough for the court reporter to capture every single word. I will not push for federal fraud charges on the credit cards. But my leniency comes with 3 non-negotiable conditions. First, you will immediately sign a permanent, legally binding no-contact order. You will never approach me, call me, or attempt to communicate with me for the rest of your natural lives. Second, you will fully withdraw all future claims to my personal assets. Third, you will sign a strict repayment schedule to eliminate every single dollar of the fraudulent debt you accumulated in my name within 90 days. My father looked up at me, his eyes entirely hollow. He was completely broken. The man who had ruled our family through fear and financial manipulation had just been entirely stripped of his power, his money, and his property in less than 30 minutes. He had absolutely no leverage left. If he refused, he and my mother would face severe financial ruin and potential jail time. He picked up the pen with trembling fingers and signed the settlement agreement. My mother and sister silently followed suit, their tears staining the legal parchment. I stood up from the defense table, gathering my coat and my purse. I did not yell, I did not gloat, I did not offer them any emotional closure or a tearful goodbye. I simply looked down at them one final time before walking away. You came to court today to ask a judge to take my money, I said, my tone completely devoid of any remaining affection. And the court just legally confirmed that the only thing you actually own is a lie. I turned my back on them and walked out of the heavy oak doors into the bright morning sunlight, leaving them entirely trapped in the agonizing consequences of their own making. 3 months later, I officially sold the colonial house out from under them, using the massive equity to completely fund my relocation to a brand new city 2,000 miles away. I changed my phone number, deleted my old social media profiles, and built a beautifully quiet, meticulously clean life where my hard-earned money belonged exclusively to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you have ever been turned into the living bank account for your own toxic family members, please comment below and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. I would love to connect and hear your thoughts. Please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hit the thanks button so this story can be heard by even more people who might need it.